from Daniel chapter 8 that it only talks about one little horn power. It doesn't talk about two, it only talks about one. And we know that the little horn power that comes out of one of the four horns in Daniel chapter 8 represents pagan Rome, but then after a certain amount of time, it represents papal Rome. And the reason why is because what God is trying to convey there is that it's the same system, and it's only changed its garb of sanctity. There's not two kingdoms there, okay? It's the Roman Empire in the form of the Roman Empire, the pagan Roman Empire, and then it's still the Roman Empire in the form of the papacy now as the Caesar. And it's the Holy Roman Empire now. That's the basis of Daniel chapter 8. But then we get into Daniel chapter 11. Okay? So verse 27, it says, both these kings' hearts, who? The king of the north and the king of the south, shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper. For yet the end shall be at the time appointed. So the time of the end, when is the time of the end? Because we know that as Adventists. We can do a whole study on it. We don't have time right now. But when is the time of the end? It's 1798. 1798 is the time of the end. So we know from verse 28 that we're somewhere before, we're somewhere after Augustus and somewhere before the time of the end. With this battle, using figurative language to explain these guys, between the battle between the king of the north and the king of the south. It says in verse 28, then shall he return. Who's the he? Who's the he? The king of the north. The king of the north. It's either the king of the north or the king of the south at this point. Right? There's no one else is being spoken of except for these two individuals. That will be important later. It says, he shall return into his own land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land. Wow, so the king of the north, representing pagan Rome, would be against the holy covenant? What is the holy covenant? The holy covenant is the law of God. The holy covenant is righteousness by faith. And so, God's sanctuary, all the pillars of Adventism. So this power is specifically against those things. Does that more fit Turkey or Rome? Rome, of course Rome. Verse 29, it says, and at the time appointed he shall return and come toward the south. Who's it talking about? King of the north. But it shall not be as the former or as the latter. For the ships of Shittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. So this power is going to work with those who are against God's people. This fight is not just against the king of the north and the king of the south. It's against God's people. It's against God's people. And so, who does that fit the best when we're talking about? Because it's not just talking about trying to kill people. It's talking about being against God's covenant. Who does that fit better? Does that fit pagan and papal Rome better? Or does that fit Turkey better? Pagan and papal Rome, of course. They have done more damage theologically to God's kingdom than Turkey and Islam has ever even hoped to. It says, he shall have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. And then you have verse 31, and arms shall stand on his part. And they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. That's interesting. What does Mrs. White say the abomination of desolation is? Well, she gives an example in the Great Controversy. She says when paganism and sun worship were put the insignia of the Roman armies, when that was pierced into the ground, when the armies surrounded Jerusalem in 70 AD, Actually, it was 66 at this time. In 66 AD, when they put their sign, their insignia of sun worship into the ground, they were planting paganism and sun worship onto the holy place, the most holy place. And Ezekiel talks about how the land itself was holy, was considered to be holy. And so, when the church and the state mixed together, and when paganism or sun worship entered into God's sanctuary, that represented the abomination that maketh desolate. In the last days, the abomination of desolation will be when we have a Sunday law. So all the same tenets are going to be there. You're going to have sun worship being infused with the church, right? With God's Christian church. It's going to be upheld in the same way that sun worship was pierced into the ground literally, that Mrs. White talks about in The Great Controversy. And then you're also going to have the church and the state together, which is what you had going on in the first century as well. So those are the examples. Now, again, who fits that better? Pagan and papal Rome or Islam? Papal Rome does that because it's specifically Christian. That's what makes the abomination of desolation. See, God doesn't care so much to call it that name anyways. He doesn't care so much about other countries who have a theocracy of their own. Because they're different religions. They're either pagan religions or there's some modern version of monotheism that we have. It's when it's Christian that it becomes the abomination of desolation, or when people are making entry into the temple. And so, when we look at this verse just one more time here, it says, "He shall pollute the sanctuary of strength and take away the daily, and the place of abomination that maketh desolate." So if we look back to Daniel chapter 8, and really it wouldn't even matter whichever way you look at it, because either way, it's Rome. But if you go back to Daniel chapter 8 and the little horn and its wickedness, when you go to verse 11 of Daniel chapter 8, it says this, "Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And a host was given him against the daily by reason of this transgression, and it cast the truth to the ground, and it practiced and it prospered." Folks, once again, who are we talking about? In Daniel 8, we're talking about Rome. In Daniel 11, we're talking about Rome. And they're calling Rome the king of the north here. And so we get to verse 32, and it says, "Such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits." So a lot of people will be turned to this false religion. That's what it says. They'll be turned against God in some way. Verse 33, "And they that understand among the people shall instruct many. Yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame and by captivity and by spoil many days." Both pagan and papal Rome did that. Verse 34, "Now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries." You know, it's quite interesting. There was a lot of flattery and bribery going on with the Waldenses. I don't know if you know that history. The Catholic Church was constantly trying to bribe them and to flatter them into keeping the Catholic form of religion rather than keeping true to God and to his Sabbath. Verse 35, "And some of them of understanding shall fall to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed." What? What did it just say? It just said that this is going to continue. This martyrdom of people is going to continue all the way till when? Till the time of the end. So it's now given you all the way till 1798. It's saying that this is going to occur. What does that encompass? Does that encompass the Ottoman Empire? Or does that encompass pagan and papal Rome, who are martyring Christians. Once again, folks, it's the Dark Ages. Rome fits better. Verse 36, it says, "And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt" who? The king of the north. Context, folks, context. "And he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done." Mimicking almost the same exact language of Daniel chapter 8. Verse 37, "Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all." Does Turkey do that, or does Rome? Rome magnifies themselves. Rome says that I am God. That's what Rome says. Turkey, Islam, they don't do that. Verse 38, it says, "But in his estate," who? The king of the north still. "Shall he honor the God of forces." He will use force. That's what Rome has always done, used force. "The God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver and precious stones and pleasant things. Thus shall he do," who? Who's the he? The king of the north. "In the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain." Did they divide the land for gain? Absolutely. Absolutely. The feudal system, peasants didn't own any land. Only the lords did. They divided the land for gain in that system in which they set up. So we're at pagan and papal Rome throughout this whole thing, up to this point. And now we get to verse 40, and all of a sudden this is Turkey? This is what it says. "And at the time of the end," when's that? 1798, "shall the king of the south push at him." Who's the him? Who have the other verses been talking about this whole time? The king of the north. So the king of the south shall push at him. So that begs the question, who is the king of the south? Because now the king of the south needs to push at who? Pagan papal Rome. In 1798, there is no pagan Rome anymore, so we're looking at papal Rome. We're looking at papal Rome and the Holy Roman Empire. The king of the south is going to push at him. You know who Uriah Smith says is the him here? They say that the king of the south, which represents Egypt, not represents, is literally Egypt in this place, shall push at him. They say, oh, well, that's because Egypt started a fight with Napoleon. So Napoleon is just randomly inserted as the him here. That's not logical. I don't care if Uriah Smith says it or William Miller or any of the other pioneers. That's not the context that we have. Every single he, him that's been referred to here so far has been referencing the work that has gone on from the king of the north, which we know represents pagan and papal Rome, all the way up to verse 39. And so if we read it using our brains and not Uriah Smith's brain, what you end up reading is, at the time of the end, so in 1798, shall the king of the south push at him, the king of the north. And the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. So there's going to be a pushing from the king of the south against the king of the north, and it's going to end with a whirlwind coming in and destroying the king of the south. It goes on, it says, he shall enter into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon, who are related to Israel, individuals who are related to Israel. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. The land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver and over all precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and Ethiopians shall be at his steps. Libya and Ethiopia are the historical allies of Egypt throughout the Bible. Verse 44, it says, but the tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Who's the him? The king of the north. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. And he shall plant, who's the he? The king of the north. He shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain, and he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. And then verse 12, chapter 12, verse 1, remember there's no chapter deviations here. So it says, and at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. Does Michael literally stand up, or is this figurative language? It's figurative language, right? Who's Michael? Michael's symbolic language as well, isn't it? Who's Michael? Michael is Jesus Christ. It says, and there shall be a time of trouble. Is that figurative language? Yes. Yes, it is. Time of trouble. Such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. Is that figurative language? Oh yeah. Shut up the book. Tell me, was there a time when people were reading the Bible and they would try to turn to Daniel chapter 1 and they couldn't because it would just automatically skip to the next book? Is that literal language or figurative language? It's figurative. The book is sealed until the time of the end. But even then, there were exceptions to that. There were individuals that even before 1798 had cracked some of the code on this stuff between Daniel chapter 7 and identifying the papacy. Isaac Newton being one of those individuals. So there's figurative language there. So why aren't we allowing for figurative language for the phrase the king of the north and the phrase the king of the south? When the king of the north, who was the Seleucid Empire, gets taken over by pagan Rome, nobody seems to have a problem with calling pagan Rome the king of the north. They just have a problem calling papal Rome the king of the north. And yet, we go back to the original point that was made. You cannot divorce Daniel chapter 11 from Daniel chapter 8. You cannot divorce the two. And Daniel chapter 8 is not talking about the Ottoman Empire. Daniel chapter 8 is talking about pagan and papal Rome, with the time period of the 2300 days ending in 1844, and with the time periods in Daniel chapter 12, which is the explanation of Daniel chapter 8, ending in the same time frame. The 1335 days and the 1290 days. They both end the same way. It's very, very clear. And so with that, we need to understand that Babylon is a spiritual figurative term. The book by Alexander Hislop, The Two Babylons, or Papal Worship, he talks about how the religion of Babylon is mirrored in every way by the Roman Catholic Church system. Some of the things he points out is the priesthood power. The confessional was used. Deceptive practices that they did, how they would fool their own people and get money, exact money out of them. The doctrinal and pagan origins are even the same. Actually, the sun worship that was in Babylon, after Babylon was overthrown, transferred into the land of what today is Turkey. And from there, that Babylonian religion was transferred again into the pagan Roman Empire. The Pontifex Maximus. That title, that comes from the Babylonian high priest. It's the same title. Paul?
Well, when you look at Babylon, it was the only place spoken of in the Bible, other than Rome, that tried to set up a phony Sabbath. I mean, they're
Yeah.
parallel on that.
Yeah, that's true.
So, I mean, when that man made that statement, he's absolutely correct, that it follows closely the religion of Rome, follows the religion of Babylon. They want to be God,
That's
above
right.
God. That was the issue.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And so we see that, I mean, it's very clear. The head of the church, the Pope, the high priest, all of that, it's mirrored in both Babylon and the Roman Catholic Church system. Marian worship and Semiramis, it goes back to, he makes a great case about how Marian worship goes back to the Mary that is supposedly Jesus' mother is actually, that's for the cattle, that's for the Goyim to believe. Who is Mary really in the Catholic Church? Mary is Semiramis. Mary is Ishtar. Mary is the female goddess, the moon goddess. And so you see both of those things in the Roman Catholic Church system, though under different names, versus the Babylonian system. And so let's look at who is the symbolic or figurative king of the south, because we have to look at the king of the south in the context of the passage. And the king of the south pushes at the king of the north when? At the time of the end, in 1798. That's when papal Rome received her deadly wound, isn't it? And so who did the pushing at that point? That's going to identify who it is. Does that mean that if you look at history and you find that it's France, does that mean that France is the king of the south? Well, yes and no. We'll take a look. Exodus chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. It says, listen to the mindset of Egypt, the mindset of Pharaoh. Remember, throughout the Bible, Egypt is painted as the land of unbelief. The land of unbelief. God took us out of Egypt, right? And that applies to us today, because there's a spiritual truth. There's a dual understanding of that. He literally took the Israelites out of Egypt, but he spiritually took all of us out of Egypt, because all of us, to one degree or another, have been captive and in bondage to sin. And the reason why, mainly, is because we did not believe. We did not believe God, or we did not trust God. But it boils down to unbelief in the end. We didn't believe that we could overcome, even if you were born in the church. If you were born in the Seventh-day Adventist church, there's at some point you hadn't believed in the true message of righteousness by faith. Otherwise, you'd be a sinless person. And so listen to the mindset of the Egyptian, okay? Pharaoh. It says, and afterward Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, thus saith the Lord God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast unto me in the wilderness. And Pharaoh said, who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go. What did Pharaoh say here? Pharaoh said, I'm an atheist. That's what he said. I don't believe God exists. I don't know him. Mrs. White makes it clear. Revelation chapter, it's not Mrs. White here, but Revelation chapter 11, which is talking about the French Revolution, verses 4 through 8, tells us, spiritually speaking, that France, during the French Revolution, when they de-Christianized their country, when they burned Bibles in the streets, and when they outlawed Christianity throughout the land, when they killed those who were, because they had already pushed out the Protestants, so the only people left were Catholics, when they killed the Catholic priests, and they changed their churches into temples of reason, okay? The Bible says that that power that did that, which was France, who did that, that power represents Egypt, spiritually speaking, land of unbelief. Revelation chapter 11, verses 4 through 8 says, these are the two olive trees and the two candlesticks standing before the God of the earth. And if any man will hurt them, fire proceedeth out of their mouth and devoureth their enemies. And if any man will hurt them, he must in this manner be killed. These have power to shut heaven, that it rain not in the days of their prophecy, and have power over waters to turn them to blood, and to smite the earth with all plagues as often as they will. And when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit, interesting, shall make war against them, and shall overcome them and kill them. And their dead bodies shall lie in the streets of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt. It's kind of interesting when you start to believe in atheism, when you start to encourage unbelief in your society, what happens to your society? It becomes very, very much like Sodom, doesn't it? So all this LGBTQ stuff, where does that come from? It comes from unbelief. That's where it comes from. So spiritually, it says, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. Was Jesus crucified in Egypt, literally? No. Was Jesus crucified in Egypt spiritually? Yes. He was crucified in the form of the policies from the National Assembly in France, who outlawed Christianity in their land and burned their Bibles in the streets. And they outlawed Christianity for 3.5 years, which is what this passage says later on in the chapter, that this would take place for 3.5 days. And there's dates that you can see, the dates at when they made this law, and then when they turned the law around and said, okay, it's fine now. 3.5 years France did this. 3.5 years, France became Egypt, spiritually speaking. So the king of the south, who is Egypt, right, in a literal sense, symbolically, Egypt is the land of unbelief. And France, during the time of 1798, was the land of unbelief. They were. And so when it says the king of the south pushed at the king of the north, France fits as the king of the south. The king of the south is a spiritual kingdom. It's a kingdom that lives throughout the entire world. There are atheists in every country under every various creeds that they have. Their government is communism. Their economics is socialism. Their science is evolution. This is a religion, and they've killed people. They've killed hundreds of millions of people. They're militant atheism. That's what this is talking about. That's what the king of the south is. Militant atheism. That's what France was. And that's what they were spreading. They were overthrowing the monarchies, and they were spreading republics, but it was a republic without God. Whereas in the United States, you had a republic with God. Just look at the Declaration of Human Rights that they have here. This is where humanism was born. Look at the way they wrote this. They wrote this to mock God. They wrote it like it was a 10 Commandments of his own, didn't they? So the king of the south represents Egypt. Mrs. White makes it even more clear. She says this in The Great Controversy: the great city in whose streets the witnesses are slain, and where their bodies lie, is spiritually Egypt. Of all nations presented in Bible history, Egypt most boldly denied the existence of the living God and resisted his commands. No monarch ever ventured upon more open and high-handed rebellion against the authority of heaven than did the king of Egypt. When the message was brought to him by Moses in the name of the Lord, Pharaoh proudly answered, "Who is Jehovah, that I should hearken unto his voice to let Israel go? I know not Jehovah, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." Exodus chapter 5, verse 2. This is atheism, she says. Egypt, spiritually speaking, is atheism. Egypt is the king of the south. Therefore, the king of the south is, spiritually speaking, what? Atheism. With their philosophy of humanism, their style of government, their economics, and their science. And the nation represented by Egypt would give voice to a similar denial of the claims of the living God and would manifest a spirit of unbelief and defiance. The great city is also compared spiritually to Sodom. The corruption of Sodom and breaking the law of God was especially manifested in licentiousness. And this sin was also a preeminent characteristic of the nation that should fulfill the specifications of this scripture, which was France. Mrs. White goes on, great controversy, page 273 and 274. The atheistical power that ruled in France, no question, right? No question now. Atheism, France, King of the South. The King of the South pushes at the King of the North in 1798. It all fits perfectly. The atheistical power that ruled in France during the Revolution and the Reign of Terror did wage such a war against God and His holy word that the world had never witnessed. The worship of the deity was abolished by the National Assembly. Bibles were collected and publicly burned with every possible manifestation of scorn. The law of God was trampled underfoot. The constitutions of the Bible were abolished. The weekly rest day was set aside, and in its stead, every 10th day was devoted to reveling in blasphemy. Baptism and the communion were prohibited, and announcements posted conspicuously over the burial places declared death to be an eternal sleep. The fear of God was said to be far from the beginning of wisdom, and that it was the beginning of folly. All religious worship was prohibited except that of liberty and of the country. And what took place at this time? Something that history remembers as the Reign of Terror. They killed their own king. They killed Marie Antoinette. Not saying those are great people or they're good people necessarily, but they slaughtered people. They killed their politicians. They killed people who, it got to the point where if you said monsieur, which was a way of showing submission to someone, you could be tried and killed for that during the Reign of Terror. If you were a practicing Christian, you could be killed for that. Isn't it interesting that even though Louis XVI, and Catholicism was outlawed in the country, and he was sentenced to death by the National Assembly, that his last rites were read to him still because of his request by a Jesuit priest. Isn't that interesting? Because that is the power that's behind this atheism. You see, France happened, atheism happened, and the papacy receiving its deadly wound happened was because they tried to abolish the Jesuit order. That's an internal struggle between the church. That's why in Daniel 11 you see this picture painted as they speak lies at one table and then they do something else because they're working together. And just like pagan and papal Rome took over the literal Egypt, the papal Rome today controls both sides. They control the left and the right. They control the atheists and the unbelief and the evangelical movements and ecumenical movements. They control both. And they have for quite some time. Great Controversy, page 279 says, with the flight of the Huguenots, a general decline settled upon France. Flourishing manufacturing cities fell into decay. Because remember, before this happened, the Catholics had waged war against the Protestants. There was an Inquisition there, and the Huguenots had to flee. They went to all different places. Some of them came here to Florida. They were killed by Spaniards here in Florida at a place called Fort Caroline. Flourishing manufacturing cities fell into decay. This is what happened after the Protestants left. Fertile districts returned to their native wildness. Intellectual dullness and moral declension succeeded a period of unwanted progress. Paris became one vast almshouse. And it is estimated that the breaking out of the revolution, 200,000 paupers claimed charity from the hands of the king. The Jesuits alone flourished in the decaying nation and ruled with dreadful tyranny over churches and schools, the prisons and the galleys. Who ruled in France? The Jesuit order. That's what Mrs. White says. The gospel, she goes on, the gospel would have brought to France the solution of those political and social problems that baffled the skill of her clergy, her king, and her legislators, and finally plunged the nation into anarchy and ruin. But under the domination of Rome, the people had lost the Savior's blessed lessons of self-sacrifice and unselfish love. They had been led away from the practice of self-denial for the good of others. The rich had found no rebuke for their oppression of the poor no help for their servitude and degradation. The selfishness of the wealthy and powerful grew more and more apparent and oppressive. For centuries, the greed and profligacy of the noble resulted in grinding extortion toward the peasant. The rich wronged the poor, and the poor hated the rich. Page 282, Great Controversy. Unhappy France reaped in blood the harvest she had sown. Terrible were the results of her submission to the controlling power of Rome. Where France, under the influence of Romanism, had set up the first stake at the opening of the Reformation, there the Revolution set up its first guillotine. On the very spot where the first martyrs to the Protestant faith were burned in the 16th century, the first victims were guillotined in the 18th. And repelling the gospel which would have brought her healing, France had opened the door to infidelity and ruin. When the restraints of God's law were cast aside and it was found that the laws of man were inadequate to hold in check the powerful tides of human passion, the nation swept on to revolt and anarchy. The war against the Bible inaugurated an era which stands in the world's history as the reign of terror. Peace and happiness were banished from the homes and hearts of men. No one was secure. He who triumphed today was suspected, condemned tomorrow. Violence and lust held undisputed sway. Do you see that today? Do you see violence and lust in the streets? Is atheism behind a lot of this? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Do we see the rise of communism today? Oh, yeah. How about socialism? Yeah. How about evolution? Do you see the ideas of evolution taught everywhere? Taken for granted, actually, that they're truth when they're so illogical. Folks, the king of the South is pushing, even now, at the king of the North. What will be the result? According to Daniel chapter 11. The king of the north will come back like a whirlwind with many ships. You know, it's interesting. Some of these younger kids are really into a lot of these different podcasts. And you have a lot of these different voices now, younger voices, that are speaking to people about coming back to God. You know what they're saying? They're saying Protestantism is the problem in the United States because Protestantism led to the rise of feminism. This is what they're saying on podcasts that Gen Z and Generation Alpha and Millennials primarily are listening to. Candace Owens is a big voice. Her husband is a dyed-in-the-wool Catholic. When she mentions Catholicism, she always talks about how she's making her way back to the Catholic Church, even though she was Protestant. There are others who are Greek Orthodox who are talking about how all the problems in going on in society today can be laid at the feet of Protestantism. Andrew Wilson, the great debater, Andrew Wilson's one example. What's his name, who did the What is a Woman thing? What's his name, Matt Waltz? I think so. He's Roman Catholic. He condemns Protestantism. Michael Knowles, another one, condemns Protestantism. Roman Catholic. Doesn't like condemn it, you know, but they say things. There's others who are standing up against abortion. Females that talk about how they came back to the Roman Catholic Church. It's a psyop, guys. It's fake. They control both sides, and they're controlling the counterculture movement that is going to push people into the other camp. What they've done over the last few years is they have turned people into lustful, licentious, atheistic people through education, through society, through entertainment, through every means possible. And now they're doing a countercultural movement, which is bringing people back to God because people are seeing the problems in society caused by this philosophy. It's the king of the south and the king of the north at war. And I'll close with this slide. It's all part of the plan, and it's been part of the plan since the 1800s. The man who wrote Morals and Dogma, Albert Pike, 33rd degree Freemason, wrote a letter to the socialist activist Mazzini, who was suspected to be a Jesuit as well, in Italy. It's recorded where they record how the world wars would take place, that they were planning. It's in the book by Des Griffin, Descent into Slavery, page 38 and 39, and we'll close. In the decades that followed, it became apparent that in order to achieve their goal of world domination, they would have to instigate a series of world wars which would result in the leveling of the old world order in preparation for the construction of the new world order. This plan was outlined in graphic detail by Albert Pike, the sovereign grand master of the ancient and accepted Scottish rite of Freemasonry, and the top illuminist in America, in a letter to Giuseppe Mazzini, dated the 15th of August 15th, 1871. Paul, you want to add something first before we go into them?
Well, I was just going to say, Mazzini really wrote the Communist Manifesto. He was Catholic, denounced it, but on his deathbed, had a Jesuit priest give him the last rites.
That's interesting.
On his deathbed,
Yeah.
he requested that. So he was a plant by the Catholic Church.
Absolutely. That's what they do. That's what they do.
And Stalin marched by Mazzini's orders. Not one-on-one, but he used all his playbooks.
Oh, that's interesting. This is what Rome does. Remember, we've read quotes up here before where it says a Jesuit who is in disguise will preach against the Roman Catholic Church. Just because someone's preaching against the Catholic Church doesn't mean they can be trusted in every way. So if they preach everything right, but then get righteousness by faith wrong, by their fruits you shall know them. Be careful who you listen to. And you don't know, we don't know, it's not our place to say whether that person or this person over here is a plant, unless there's evidence, or if they're just don't understand something. But it doesn't matter. Because the reality is, we have to trust no one and try everything that we hear and compare it with Scripture. So this quote goes on. They'll talk about the First World War here. It says, Pike stated that the First World War was to be fomented in order to destroy Tsarist Russia. That's exactly what happened in World War I. And the King of the South took over Russia at that time, didn't he? And to place that vast land under the direct control of Illuminati agents. Russia was then to be used as a boogeyman to further the aims of the Illuminati worldwide. The World War II was to be fomented through manipulation of the differences that existed between German nationalists and political Zionists. That's interesting. Is that what took place? What are political Zionists? Those who support Israel versus German nationalists. Who are the German nationalists? What were they called? The Nazi Party. And let me tell you something. If you want to know what's going to happen in the future, look at the Nazis. Look what happened in their politics. Because they had a transgender movement there too. They were burning books in the streets of books that we probably would agree shouldn't be available. right? Do we have books available to the kids right now that probably shouldn't be available? Yeah, we got the same stuff work, same playbook, guys. Same playbook. That's what's going to happen. We will have fascism. We will. That's what it's going to be here in the United States. So that happened exactly according to plan. The quote goes on. It says, "This was the result of this was to result in the expansion of Russian influence, Cold War, and the establishment of a state of Israel in Palestine." That happened in May 1948. So check and check. Now we get to the Third World War. The Third World War was planned to result from the differences stirred up by Illuminati agents between Zionists and Arabs. Have we had war in the Middle East for quite some time? Yeah. We wouldn't call it a world war per se, but maybe that's because it didn't quite go according to their plan. But it's been happening. The conflict was planned to spread worldwide. Over the Middle East, it pretty much has. There's not a country over there that hasn't been embroiled in this stuff. The Illuminati said the letter planned to unleash the nihilists and atheists. Now we're back to the king of the north and the king of the south. What's their plan, the Illuminati? They want to unleash the nihilists, people that don't believe that there is nihilism, right? People that don't believe that there's anything after death. They're basically, I would say, I can't think of the words right now, but they're pessimistic about life because there's nothing else. And atheists. It says, and to provoke a formidable social cataclysm, which in all its horror will show clearly to the nations the effect of absolute atheism, origin of savagery and the most bloody turmoil. Then, everywhere, the citizens obliged to defend themselves against the world minority of revolutionaries. Let's stop there real quick. I can't believe how accurate this is. Don't they call it the silent majority? Aren't the people who are atheists usually an extreme minority with the loudest voices and most disruptive? Wow. So let me reread that part. Then everywhere, the citizens obliged to defend themselves against the world minority of revolutionaries will exterminate those destroyers of civilization. And the multitude disillusioned with Christianity, whose deistic spirits will from that moment be without compass or direction, anxious for an ideal but without knowing where to render its adoration, will receive true light through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer, brought finally out in the public view. A manifestation which will result in the general reactionary movement which will follow the destruction of Christianity and atheism, both conquered and exterminated at the same time. Atheism will be conquered through destroying them physically. Christianity will be conquered and destroyed through deception. Because the pure doctrine of Lucifer, who was always against the law of God, it will be the same. His doctrine will be against the law of God. It will be a Sunday law. His religion throughout all time has been sun worship. It will be sun worship. That's what a Sunday law is. And Christianity will be destroyed because of that. Because true Christianity is not Sunday worship. And so there you have it. There's no way. These people, these aren't prophets. These aren't prophets. They planned this. And yet, God warned us about this in Daniel chapter 11. This very same elements all